Last time, we looked at chord functions and how we can utilize chord functions to better understand why chord progressions work, as well as build our own. However, we barely scratched the surface, as there are many approaches to taking a well-known chord progression and spicing it up. We ended the previous episode with the 1-4-2-5 progression. This chord progression, thanks to the chord functions we learned last episode, sounds harmonically correct, but we could easily make it sound more interesting and way more applicable to a K-pop production. So far, the chords we looked at were triads. Even though these chords only contain 3 notes, simply by shifting them around we can already make some big changes. This is called the root position, since the chords are built on top of the root note. However, we can change the order of the notes without changing the contents of a chord, and we call this a chord inversion. Instead of having the C being the lowest note, we can move the C up an octave and have the E as our lowest note. This would be our first inversion. Now, we could also move the E up an octave, which would leave us with G as our lowest note. The second inversion. You don't need to remember these names now, but using inversions not only changes the sound of a chord, but it also allows us to make the transitions from one chord to another smoother. If we look at the chord progression we had before, we can notice some bigger jumps from one chord to another. We could move some of the notes up and down an octave so that the chords are much closer to each other, making them flow into each other much better. Here are some K-pop examples which use chord inversions. But we can play with the note layout within a chord progression even more. Currently our notes occupy roughly an octave. However, we can add notes for richer sounds. Which notes simply the same as before, just in different octaves. A fun trick used in EDM, which a lot of K-pop is inspired by, is taking the middle notes of each chord and moving it up an octave. This trick also works especially nicely with synth chords and pads. This is how the same chord progression sounds before and after this trick. But we can also add different notes to our chords. So far, we built chords by using a root, a third, and a fifth note. However, chords can be more complex than just triads. A popular choice is seventh chords. As you can tell by the name, those are built simply by adding the seventh note to our triad. So if we take our C major scale from before and its first chord and we added a seventh to it, we would get C major 7. Listen to how different they sound. But what if we added a seventh to a minor chord, for example A minor? We would get A minor 7. Here are some examples from K-pop. There are other types of seventh chords we may cover in another video, such as dominant seventh chords. However, the takeaway here is that seventh chords sound much more dreamy and can add a particular flavor to our chord progression. Historically, seventh chords were particularly favored in jazz, but nowadays many other styles include them often too, and K-pop is no different. To summarize, knowing how to play with chord voicings and inversions, as well as knowing how to spice up triads with seventh notes, will give you plenty to work with when building your own chord progressions. Of course, there's a lot more we can do to make chord progressions more intriguing. We don't even need to stick to our chosen scale for that. And that's why we are exploring borrowed chords in the next episode. Subscribe so you don't miss it.